I'm Valerie Aurora. I'm here to talk about why I think 2016 should be the year that we focus on allies for diversity and inclusion in technology. Nikhil is handing out cards around. This talk only goes for about 30 minutes of me speaking, and then I really like to have 20 minutes of questions and answers. And I find that you get the best questions if people are able to write them down and pass them up. We'll also do like raise your hand kind of questions as well. So I'd love for you to be thinking about questions you have and either ask them with your hand or on the card at the end. So I will tell you a little bit about myself. I'm the founder of Frameshift Consulting, which is a diversity and inclusion in technology consultancy, surprisingly enough. Before that, I was the co-founder and executive director of the ADA Initiative, which was a nonprofit for women in open technology and culture. So things like open source software and Wikipedia and fan culture. So I did that for about 5 years. The very first project we did at the ADA Initiative with my co-founder, Mary Gardner, was to write the Code of Conduct, which is now in use by hundreds and thousands of tech conferences, including every major open source software conference today. So I've also, before that, I spent about 10 years working as a volunteer with various international groups like Geek Feminism, which is intersectional feminism for people who are interested in geeky pursuits like software or Legos or things like that. I've also taught the Ally Skills Workshop, which I'll talk about a few times in this talk, across the world, including Spain, Germany, Australia, Ireland, Canada, Mexico, and the US. And boy, there's a lot of variations in the United States. So, before that, I was a Linux operating systems developer specializing in file systems for about 10 years. I worked on things like actually ZFS for Solaris and ext3 and ext4 and some experimental file system changes. All right, so I'm going to go through some terminology first because you can't know how to focus on allies unless you know what an ally is. So to get there, we need to do a little more vocabulary first. First, privilege is an unearned advantage given by society to some people, but not all. And the emphasis is on unearned. Oppression is systemic pervasive inequality that is present throughout society that benefits people with more privilege and harms those with fewer privileges, right? And I'll go into some examples in a moment. So that gets us to these two terms. A target is someone who suffers from oppression. You can also say a member of a marginalized group. And an ally, then, is a member of a social group that enjoys some privilege, who's doing these two things, working to end oppression and trying to understand their own privilege. And it's really important to know that these are actions, right? Being an ally isn't an identity. Like being a member of a marginalized group, that's an identity. That's a thing that you just are, whether or not you're taking action. Being an ally is something that is just through actions every day. So I like to talk more about ally skills than being an ally, personally. And it's interesting, in different situations, you might be a target. And in other situations, you might be an ally. It depends on what part of your identity is the most salient at that time, right? So that's all very high level and theoretical. So let's do an example of a privilege that some of you may not know that you have. So you may have the privilege which is the ability to walk into a convenience store and have the owner assume that you were there to buy things instead of steal them. Oppression is the self-reinforcing system of stories, TV, news coverage, and the legal system that stereotypes black people as criminals, benefits non-black people, and harms black people, right? So in this case, the target is any black person who wants to enter a convenience store, which is probably a non-trivial number of people. And an ally in this situation is a non-black person who takes these actions. For example, donates to legal system reform, actively objects when people tell racist stories in their presence, votes in anti-racist ways, or reads news articles about this privilege. Or Harvard Business Review is pretty good for these things. All right. Any questions on what these things mean? All right, great. We'll move on. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the words diversity and inclusion because I think there are frequently misunderstandings of what these terms mean. So first, diversity is the state of having people in a group who differ along the lines of things like race, gender, sexuality, age, disability, religion, class, and caregiver status, by which I mean, are you the primary parent? Are you taking care of perhaps one of your parents who needs a lot of help? Things like that. So the reason we started saying diversity and inclusion instead of just diversity is that a lot of people were focusing on the diversity part, like let's get a diverse group of people, and they weren't doing the second part, which is in a diverse group, everyone feels equally included, respected, and powerful, right? It doesn't help if you have a bunch of people if those people are unequal and don't have equal rights with each other. So here's a couple of misunderstandings I see here. First of all, people will talk about a diverse person or a diverse hire. There's no such thing. An individual isn't diverse. Diversity is the property of a group, right? So adding one of these yellow smiley face ball to this pile of yellow smiley face balls does not change the diversity of this group. If you add it to this pile of balls, yes, it will influence the diversity of the group. So diversity is the property of a group. And finally, many efforts really focus up front on the diversity part. For example, at a tech company, hiring people who are a more diverse group of people, but they don't follow through on making those people feel welcome and actually giving them power and influence, right? So those are the two interesting things I like to point out about diversity and inclusion. So here's some examples of common diversity and inclusion efforts. There's volunteer-run affinity groups, thousands of women in technology organizations, or getting more specific, Blackbirds at Twitter for Black employees, tech employees, I believe, at Twitter. Travel scholarships for members of marginalized groups, coding boot camps for targets, advice books which are aimed at targets, volunteer-run mentoring programs. For some reason, nobody wants to pay people to mentor people who are members of underrepresented groups. Recruiting outreach, so going to, say, historically black colleges and universities when you're recruiting. And conferences aimed at members of marginalized groups. So this is one conference I helped run called Ada Camp. It's for women in open technology and culture. And people were having fun, it looks like. So here's what I think is wrong with diversity and inclusion today. Most of the efforts are focused on changing the behavior of targets. There's very little work that's focused on changing the behavior of allies. So I'd like to talk more about why that is. There's some good reasons, some bad reasons. There's a lot of reasons. So to start with, targets are more personally motivated, right, to make change. If a target would like to see the world become more equal and inclusive because it personally benefits them. So it's not difficult to motivate them to change their own behavior. Targets are often already aware of oppression. It's not always the case. One of the ways that you can make it through a field that you're not supposed to be in, stereotypically, is to be unaware that what people really meant by that comment was, people with your skin color shouldn't be here, right? But most of the time, targets are already aware, so you don't have to go through that initial stage of education, like, hey, did you know that the world is unfair? So targets are often lower status and easier to tell what to do. It's much easier to tell your intern that you have for the summer to speak up more in meetings than it is to tell your CEO to stop interrupting your intern in meetings, right? So we tend to go in that direction of what's the safest, easiest thing to do. It's to tell people with less power how to change their behavior. Targets are often seen as the cause of the problem. Like a good example here is you'll often see people, jokingly or not, suggesting that the way to end sexual harassment in the workplace is to ban women from the workplace. This ignores the reality that statistically most workplace sexual harassment is perpetrated by men. So the most effective way to stop sexual harassment in the workplace would be to ban men from the workplace, right? I don't recommend either of these solutions, but it just goes to show how it's framed as the targets are the cause of the problem. If we just cause the targets to wear fewer spaghetti-strapped tank tops, we wouldn't have this problem anymore. And finally, it avoids confronting feelings of guilt in privileged people, right? It's much easier to say, hey, it's your fault as a target for not dressing right or speaking right or going to the right school or working into the evenings for free, right? It's much harder to say, hey, wow, I'm benefiting from this and I feel guilty and I need to change and take action for this. So those are some of the reasons we focus on this. So I'd like to talk about what's wrong with focusing on targets. Like what are the problems with this sort of approach? So let's start with targets are overworked. There's this famous apocryphal saying that Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did except backwards and in high heels, right? The dancing couple. And it's maybe not technically true, but it really reflects, it resonates for people because they have this experience at work. This is for women, this is the only book of advice at Targets I will recommend. It's called What Works for Women at Work. And it describes a lot of the patterns that go into this kind of experience. So for example, there's something called the prove it again pattern, where because of the way our brains work, we forget things that go against our stereotypes, and we more easily remember things that confirm our stereotypes. So the result is that if you fit the stereotype of someone who is not good at work or good at leadership or good at management, you will have to be good at it twice as often in order to be recognized at the same rate as someone who fits their stereotype, right? So the other reason I like this book, there's multiple reasons I like this book. One is it's unlike Lean In, it presents, it says, hey, there's systemic oppression in the workplace. You can't solve it as a target of that oppression, but here are some ways for you to cope to make your life a little bit better, right? That's achievable. The other thing I like about it is that more than half of the women they interviewed for this book were women of color, and they speak specifically about how subtle variations in race, ethnicity, and background, cultural background, change the way, the techniques you'll use to cope inside the workplace. But the main thing to take away from this is if you are the victim of a negative stereotype like this, you're going to be overworked. Targets are also under more stress. So stereotype threat is the fear of confirming negative stereotypes about a group that you are part of. It's shown widely over and over again. One of the most reproducible results in sociological research is if you remind people of a negative stereotype about themselves before they take a test or do some kind of performance, they will perform worse, right? So they're already, that's a lot of stress to be under. Discrimination is pretty stressful. It sucks knowing that you are not being treated fairly by your coworkers and by the people in your life, right? That creates a great deal of mental overhead. Harassment, abuse, and assault are far more common in the workplace than we realize because so often people who are the victims of these things are afraid to report for fear of retaliation, right? So it's happening, it's highly stressful, it really is miserable to go to work when you know that somebody's got it out for you there. And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is the result of living through years of this. Like once you become aware of it and you have to just tolerate it every single day, it turns into a long-term stress problem. So, targets have less money. So here are some statistics from the United States workforce. I think they're 1 year out of date. I think they've just released new ones and I have to update them. But very recently, at least, white women made 78% of what white men make. Black men make 75% of what white men make. Mothers make 70% of what fathers make. Fathers actually get a small raise after the birth of their first child. That does not happen for mothers. Black women make 64% of what white men make. People with disabilities make 63% of what people without disabilities make. And Latinas make 56% of what white men make. So, targets are also more likely to have unpaid caregiver responsibilities, whether that's being a mother or taking care of a family member, that sort of thing. So targets are more likely to suffer retaliation. I mentioned this earlier, but there's studies showing this. So here's a study in which people presented fictional characters and asked them to give them a performance review after telling them that they'd hired someone who was from a member of a marginalized group. And the particular things they looked at was ethnic minority or ethnic majority, or male or female in the people that they were evaluating. So here's the quote from the study. Ethnic minority or female leaders who engage in diversity-valuing behavior, which is what they called this, are penalized with worse performance ratings, whereas ethnic majority or male leaders who engage in diversity-valuing behavior are not penalized for doing so. So I'll go a little bit farther than this. In my experience, when I see, in particular, white men doing diversity work, I often see them getting professional benefits, like promotions and accolades, and sometimes literal applause. So it's just a reminder, like, hey, like these same actions are going to be viewed differently depending on who's doing them. Targets are often, but not always, in the minority. So here's two groups that I was part of at various times. So here's open source contributors. By the way, I don't agree with the way they did these studies. I would not give only men and women as the choice for your gender, and I would not do men, women, and trans as the choices for gender for these surveys. But this is the data I have. In open source in 2006, 98.5% of open source contributors were men. And that, as one of that 1.5%, it became very clear to me that we couldn't ask the 1.5% to do all this work. It would take a long time to change things. And I'm an operating systems developer, right? When I'm doing performance work, I don't optimize the 1.5%. So Wikipedia editors, 90% men, 9% women, 1% trans. This is English Wikipedia, I believe. Again, you really need to have allies doing this work. Targets have less power and influence. So fewer than 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs are people of color. Fewer than 5% are women. We're shortly going to have one fewer of each when Ursula Burns retires from, I believe, Xerox this year. It's one person making a decision will change these numbers significantly. So there's something called the Smurfette principle and its application in senior leadership teams at companies. Katha Pollitt coined this term to describe TV shows that have an all-male cast with the exception of one woman character, right? Really sending the message that being a woman is the weird thing, even though, you know, it's actually 50-50 in real life, right? And Smurfette, of course, being the only Smurf in the village of 99 male Smurfs, right? So this actually has an application for senior management teams, which are in corporations, which are things like the board of directors and the C-suite, so CEO, CFO, COO. There's a study of S&P 1500 companies that found this. The probability that a woman occupies a top management team position is 51% lower if another woman holds a position on the same team. So tokenism is real, is what we're saying. And the reason it's real is because the people who are making the hiring decisions are saying, hey, one is enough. So if you ever see people who are members of the same marginalized group or even different marginalized group who seem to be inappropriately competing with each other for promotion, even though they're not working for the same position, or perhaps they are, this is why. It's not that they're inherently terrible and uncooperative, it's that there's this system that says there can be only one, right? By the way, all these slides are on the web, and there's links and speaker notes to the original research. So, finally, I left this one for last. Targets are often seen as whiny, complaining, and jealous when they're doing this work. And I decided to take one from my personal experience. When I published the code of conduct on the Geek Feminism website, here's one of the comments from somebody who had something very important to say. There's some mild cussing, I apologize. So, do you actually code anything or contribute to the open source software hardware community in any tangible way, or do you just bitch and moan about having a period and write conference conduct policies? And this is my favorite part. It is a legitimate inquiry. So at this time, I had recently written Relative A-Time, which saved billions of disk writes across the world and allowed people to turn off A-Time automatically, among all the other file systems things and Ethernet things and TCP/IP that I'd worked on, right? So there is no point at which you're not vulnerable to this criticism when you are speaking up for your own group, right? So at the same time, when you look at the existing groups out there for to improve diversity and inclusion in technology, they're all focused on changing the behavior of targets. So Black Girls Code, focused on teaching Black girls to code. Call Back Women, helping women get speaking slots at technical conferences. The rest of these you can probably guess from the names. I'll explain if they're not obvious. Natives Who Code, Lesbians Who Tech, Trans Hack, The Pregnant Scholar, Code 2040 teaches Hispanic, Latina, and Latino people to code, and Mother Coders. And of course there's Lean In, which is the work twice as hard in high heels backwards, right? So, book. And I support many of these organizations, in fact, all of them except this one. But there's an imbalance here. Here is the complete list of books, nonprofits, and organizations for allies in technology. And yes, the slide is intentionally left blank, right? There's a huge imbalance in how we're spending our time. So I really want to encourage all of you to think of 2016 as the year that we focus on allies. And I'm going to summarize why in the opposite direction. There's all the reasons we shouldn't focus on targets. Here are all the reasons we should focus on allies. Allies have more time and energy. Allies have more money. Allies aren't harmed for diversity-valuing behavior, and sometimes they even get cookies for it. Allies are often in the majority. Allies have more power and influence. And allies are seen as altruistic, giving, and kind when they speak up for members of marginalized groups. So if being an ally is about action, what do good ally skills look like? I'm going to go over about 12, I think it's 13 now, 13 ally skills, just very briefly, and hopefully give you more things to work on later. So the first ally skill is an ally self-educates. This is very important. None of this stuff is obvious. It takes a lot of work to understand what's happening in the world. You've been raised in the system of oppression that's invisible to you, and it takes effort to understand it. So it's really important not to walk up to the nearest person who looks different than you and say, hey, explain to me how this works, right? They have time, they have work to do. You're probably not paying them, that's my guess. So it's really important to figure out yourself how to go out and continue this education. I teach the Ally Skills Workshop, and I often have people ask me, like, hey, can you just send me like a list of all the words I shouldn't use? And then I'll just memorize those and then I'm done, right? And no, like language evolves continuously, where our understanding of language changes, the cultural context changes. It's ongoing work to keep up with this list of words not to use, right? So I often tell people to start with a handout. There's an Ally Skills handout that's on my website as well. And then you can start from there to figure out like what Twitter accounts you should follow, what blogs you should read. Harvard Business Review has an astonishing set of articles on diversity and inclusion that are constantly coming out, right? So get yourself in a situation where it's just this thing that you do every week, like you read something on the subject. And you use Google and things like that. So I debated whether listening should be the first skill or self-education should be the first skill. So it's really important. As someone who has a lot more privilege, you're used to talking and people listening to you, right? Well, this is a situation you're not the expert on, and you need to listen to other people in order to figure out what's happening. So a really great example of this was at the Grace Hopper celebration in 2014. There was a male allies panel in which 4 senior executives from tech companies who were men sat on stage and told these 7,000 women in the audience what great allies they were. Many people warned them that this might not go over well, and in fact, multiple press releases were required to apologize for the gaffes that they made in that panel. So one of the people on there, Alan Eustace, who was at the time a senior vice president at Google, he's retired now, got it, and after it was too late, but that's okay. And he said, hey, let's reverse the male allies panel. You talk, I listen. And then he told people which room to go to. So this is a picture of 3 of the members of that panel listening for an hour as women walked up to the microphone and talked about their experience and how miserable it was for them and how their advice yesterday had been harmful and wasn't helpful to them. So it was a fantastic example. But yeah, getting used to listening, and that requires another skill, which is shutting up. So it's not as easy as it sounds. An ally gives credit. So again, as an ally, people will assume that you did the work or that you came up with the idea, even though you haven't claimed it, or perhaps you've told people multiple times it wasn't your idea. So an example of this, there's a recent study of women academics in economics showing that if they co-authored a paper, they got almost no credit towards their tenure decision, whereas if men who were co-authors on a paper, it significantly helped their whether they got tenure. And here's the link for that down here. So here's an example of practicing this ally skill. There's a norm within social justice groups that every time you use the term intersectionality, if at all possible, you credit the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw by name when you use it. This is to stop erasing people who have contributed to this body of work, right? So, and just briefly, intersectionality is the concept that people can be subject to multiple overlapping forms of oppression, which interact and intersect with each other. So, Kimberly Crenshaw described this and gave the term for it, and she's a great example. Kimberly Crenshaw is a black woman. She gets oppression based on being black, she gets oppression based on being a woman, and she gets a special, different kind of oppression for being a black woman, right? An ally asks for consent from the target. So oftentimes to make progress in social justice, you need to, individual people will be harmed, right? It's an unpleasant part of making progress. The important thing is that you ask, as an ally, if you're going to take an action that will improve the overall good but will harm an individual person, you have to ask consent from the target. So a really good example of this is the fight for marriage equality in the United States. Part of that fight was a number of court cases in which individual same-sex couples volunteered to come forward and have their lives put under the microscope while they were, are you really a couple? Do you really want to get married? All that sort of thing. And that was harmful to them and highly stressful. But the important thing was that they volunteered for this work. An ally keeps the focus on helping targets, right? So derailing is a thing that happens. People try to change the conversation. So here's an example of an ally doing this on Twitter. Jen Schiffer, who's one of my favorite technology writers, artists, and humorists, as well as a computer programmer at Buku, says, shout out to my girls out there who want to be visible in the tech community, but also want a family and can't because Earth is terrible. Some random person says, it's a problem for fathers too. Balancing networking and family isn't easy for anyone. So changing the conversation to be about fathers, right? And as you saw from my stats before, that's not quite the same. Moisha comes in and says, as a dad, invoking his privilege, I'm going to go ahead and say that it's objectively harder for moms. So returning the conversation back to the original topic. So this is something you're going to see a lot whenever you talk about this sort of thing, is that immediately the conversation will get redirected on to how tough it is for the people who have more power and more privilege and their feelings and how they feel about it and whether they're just stressed and all that kind of stuff. And you're like, yeah, but you're stressed thinking about this. Imagine how bad it is to experience it, right? So that's your job as an ally to switch things back. So conversely, the place where an ally should take front and center is when speaking up is going to get you bad stuff, like attacked and trolled. So here's an example from Linux Weekly News, a website I used to write for back when I was a Linux programmer. Somebody's complaining about the latest UI change in Ubuntu. They say, these Ubuntu top managers are as inconstant as women often are. What? Okay. Someone else replies and says, that was a sexist remark. Not on LWN, please, right? So this, anyone want to guess what happened in the thread after this? Yeah, there's a long argument about who was more off topic, the person comparing a window manager to a cheating woman, or the person who was saying, maybe we shouldn't say that on this website about Linux, right? Yes, so it went on for quite some time. But yeah, when speaking up is going to get you in trouble, that's a better time for an ally to take the center stage. An ally uses their energy wisely. So walking to the grocery store, you're going to see oppression. Kind of the point is to conserve your energy for when your power and influence can be used the most, right? So in situations in which people know who you are, who they respect your opinion, maybe that's the time to take action. So here's an example demonstrating this. So the Feminist Frequency did a series of videos on tropes about women in video games. That was Anita Sarkeesian. And Random Egg on Twitter says, my biggest problem with Anita is that if I used her logic, I could see sexism everywhere. Yes. So Yazzer says, teetering on the brink of an epiphany, right? And this went on for ages, and I just loved it. Yes, it's true. Sexism is everywhere. Pick the places and times and actions, just like all sorts of oppression and racism and homophobia. Pick the times and places when you can have the most effect. So one of the ways to do this is to use Charles' rules of argument. This is something I teach in the Ally Skills workshop. Charles is Charles Miller. He currently works for, Wikia, yes, but at the time he wrote this, he was a man who liked to argue on the internet. He had a blog in 2004. So eventually he decided he was spending too much time arguing on the internet, and he made these rules. The first rule is don't go looking for an argument, right? There's plenty of people who are wrong on the internet. Pick the ones who are wrong on your part of the internet, right? If you do choose to have an argument, state your position once, speaking to the audience. This is because the person who has just violated Godwin's law, or whatever it is, has just happened, is probably not going to have their mind changed by your excellent argumentation. However, the audience is paying attention and they don't know what to think. And if you come across as like somebody who's done their homework and as someone they would like to emulate, they're more likely to change their mind. So focus on the audience. Step 3, wait for absurd replies. This takes about a day or two on mailing lists. It takes about 3 seconds on Twitter, right? So people will totally misinterpret what you've said, and that's okay, because the next thing you do is you reply one time in order to correct any misunderstandings of your first statement, right? And then this is the very hard part. Do not reply again. This is a rule, just don't do it. And instead go outside and play Pokemon Go, apparently is what you should do now. But whatever it is that's fun for you, you should go do that. And so this is on the Geek Feminism Wiki as well. An ally spends money. You know the slide where I told you how much more money white men make than everyone else in the world? So you can take that money and donate to organizations that are doing work in this area. In particular, as the former executive director and lead of fundraising at a nonprofit, please do not offer your time in your very, very specialized technical skill setting up Hadoop, right, or whatever it is. Because if you want to understand how difficult this is, unless the organization is set up in order to use volunteer time, and there are things like that, like Black Girls Code has a very efficient way of using volunteer time. But unless that's set up that way, imagine that you came into work tomorrow and somebody said to you, here's 500 interns, they each have 1 hour. Go. No, that would be a nightmare. You would get nothing out of that, right? So instead, spend that 1 or 2 hours making money with your specialized skill and then give that money to the organization. An ally uses their social capital. Allies tend to be better connected. They tend to be part of the friends with powerful, influential, and rich people. They tend to have more followers on the Twitters. They tend to get retweeted more, right? All that sort of thing. So they tend to get treated more seriously when they write the same blog post that someone else just wrote, 5 minutes ago. So it's some of the things you can do with this. You can ask people to donate money when you're donating to an organization you believe in. You can amplify the voices of targets, and you can encourage people to follow and read information that helps them understand their positions better. So, an ally acts even when it's uncomfortable. So. It might be really uncomfortable for you to speak up when your coworkers are using the ableist slur lame or crazy in casual conversation, like who's so uncool that they can't deal with the little weird words, right? But it's helpful to remember how uncomfortable it is to be the person who's in a wheelchair or has an undisclosed mental illness, who's having to listen to people use these words to describe bad things, right? So it's tough. It's tough to speak up. It's really uncomfortable. It's way more uncomfortable to be the subject of these things. An ally sacrifices personal gain. So here's the magic thing about privilege. Like, you don't have to sign up for it. You don't have to agree to it. It just gets handed to you all of the time. Like, I'm sure every white man on this panel thought that he belonged there and was the best person in the world to be on this panel. A great example of how you might need to give up personal gain in order to act as an ally is if you are part of a panel that's homogeneous in one of these ways, right? To say, hey, you know what, I'm not going to be part of this panel unless we have one person of color or one woman or whatever is relevant in that area who is on that panel. This may mean that you are giving up personal advantage, right? Appearing on a panel gets your name out in front of people, makes people think you're more important. You might get a free ticket to the conference. You might get free plane flights. Those are all things that there's someone out there who is equally qualified or more qualified than you who hasn't been invited because they're not part of this social network of people who have this particular privilege, right? So making a practice of inquiring. I do this myself whenever I'm asked to be part of a panel. I check to see if there are any women of color on that panel, right? And if there aren't, I suggest someone else to take my place. An ally follows leaders from marginalized groups. Again, as someone with more privilege, people just assume you're in charge, and you are used to that situation. So it's really important, though, that members of marginalized groups usually have better knowledge and information about what will actually help that group. So it's much better to follow and support people who are doing this work, who are members of this group, than to start your own thing. And finally, an ally makes mistakes. This is a thing that happens, and apologizes and moves on, right? The only way you can avoid making mistakes is to never do anything important. It's not about being perfect, it's about how you react when you make a mistake, right? So you make a mistake, don't dig in, don't try to claim that you're right, don't bring up all of the donations you ever made to a group that supports that group. Just say, hey, I'm sorry, I'll figure that out and move on. The exception here is that there's a well-known trend where trolls will falsely accuse you of doing something that's like racist or homophobic or something like that, right? So look into the source before you immediately take these sorts of things to heart. But yeah, you're not supposed to be perfect. You're supposed to learn. Part of learning is making mistakes. It's about how you react when you make a mistake. So I've gone over these 13 ally skills very quickly. Obviously, it's a high level. You can go and research these various things through the research out there. There's a lot of papers. There's a lot of blogs. I'm currently writing a book on ally skills because one doesn't really exist. There's like a couple chapters in other books that are not really focused on it. So if you follow Frameshift LLC on Twitter, you can get news about that. So the best way to learn it at this point is to attend an ally skills workshop, and all of those workshops, as far as I can tell, are taught by people who live here in the Bay Area. So the particular one I teach, the materials are freely reusable. They're under the Creative Commons Share-alike attribution license. And I also teach a train the trainers. I would like for something like the Ally Skills Workshop to be taught as widely as sexual harassment prevention training. Unless I get a law passed by Congress, that's not going to happen. But currently it's being taught at Google, Square, Slack, and Spotify, and I've got a couple other companies ramping it up. So I teach it as well, of course. So here's the things I'd like you to take away from this talk. Most diversity and inclusion efforts focus on targets. Targets have less time, energy, power, and influence. Allies have more ability to make change, and ally skills can be learned. So let's focus on changing the behavior of allies in 2016. All right, that's it. Questions and answers. I'd love to have if anyone wrote any questions on cards, or you can just raise your hand. Oh, there's a card over there. If I can get one of Nikhil. All right. Thanks. Sure. Sure. And you can just raise your hand if you have any questions as well. So. Does anyone like my ducks? All right, thanks. I'll get that one. Great, thanks.
Actually, a question. This is an announcement to the room. If anybody would like to join me in taking an ally skills workshop, I'll start a list on the whiteboard right there, and we'll figure out how to do that and that.
Great, thank you. That's awesome. If you'd like to go to an ally skills workshop, put your name on the board over there, and it will happen maybe. All right. This is a good question. How do I know when it's worth it to use my leverage? Yeah, there's a sense of, so social capital is an interesting metaphor, right? Because I think it captures two things. It's something that you can spend. It's also something you can invest and get a return on, right? This is something that I encourage people to sit down and think, like, what is my position here? Am I someone who has relative power? Do people trust me? Do they view me as the expert? Or is this a situation where people already distrust me? They view me as an outsider. They're unlikely to listen to me, right? So that being smart about when you use it, but also recognizing that you can often build your social capital by using it, by standing up and acting in a way that's difficult, that has some blowback for you, but that other people find admirable, right? And there's never any simple solution, but things I like to encourage people to think about is, like, what is the power structure? What's my position in the power structure? What are the actual penalties that I could use to enforce whatever decision I've made or suggestion I'm making? Like, for example, at a conference, it's easy to have a code of conduct because the conference organizer controls right of access to the physical space, right? So you walk over to someone and you say, hey, you violated the code of conduct, I can kick you out, right? So that's an example. And then, of course, there's the other way around of what sort of advantages do you have to offer, right? Are you the person who chooses the keynote speaker next year, right? That sort of thing. All right. Any hand questions? Yes, and I'll go to this one.
Minorities and find that they just kind of focus on differences to be incredibly focused.
Yeah. So I think the basic question is a lot of people who are targets are extremely uncomfortable with having that division pointed out, with the existence of oppression brought out and emphasized. It's terrible. Like most of us would like to be able to just do our work without having to worry about unfair discrimination, right? I think there's this false idea that if we just don't talk about it, it won't happen. And so, as much as I would like to create a world in which people could opt out of being harassed, discriminated, and unfairly judged, it's not going to happen by just not talking about it, right? I think the thing to do in that situation just is to always respect a target's desire to not do anything with this work, and to not be personally involved, and to avoid situations in which it's salient, right? So don't ask them to do to give a speech on what it's like to be an oppressed person in this workplace, right? So yeah, I wish that could be actually solved. All right, I'll answer this one, and then I'll do another question out there. What are the personal benefits of inclusion for allies? So I often get this sort of question, and it's very much focused on often this is in the context, and I apologize if this isn't the intent of the person who was asking it. It's in the context of saying, I would like to get more allies motivated to take action, right? And the idea is okay, let's appeal to, frankly, their selfish instincts, right? We're saying it's easy to get targets to take action because they can see personal benefit. Maybe we can get allies to take action to see if they see personal benefit. So the reality is that there's a lot of benefit to oppression for the people who have privilege, right? You get free stuff, you get more pay, you can abuse more people, which a lot of people really enjoy. It's kind of sweet. You get promotions you don't deserve, all that stuff. I don't think there's an argument that can overall be made in that sort of direct selfish sense. The argument that I think can be made is, what are your values as a person? Do you think that you're someone who's fair? Do you think you're someone who wants things to be equal? Do you think you're someone who's considerate of other people? Well, if you want those things to be true, it's important to educate yourself and to become an ally, to take all these actions, because otherwise you aren't living up to your self-image. This is actually one of the greatest motivating factors for human beings, is being true to your values, right? And so presenting it to people that way and saying hey, I know this is something you value, here's a way that you can act out that value and make that real, I think is a more effective way. I no longer make the argument, I know this was popular for a long time, well, diversity and inclusion, if you have more women on your board of directors, your company is more likely to make a profit and will spend less money and all that sort of stuff. I don't care about that stuff. Nobody makes those decisions for that reason. Because again, having privilege in a system of oppression is highly beneficial. The people who are running these companies, who are making these kinds of decisions, don't care that the company as a whole is being harmed, as long as they are getting personal benefit, right? It's all about oppression, and the system of oppression and privilege is all about making sure the benefits go to a specific small group of people, right? So you can't appeal on the basis of the company as a whole. And so I no longer make that argument. I do make the argument of hey, what are your values as a person, as a company? Do you want to live those out? Or do you want to work for a company that does something that you find personally disgusting, right? Not many people want to work at a job like that. So I think that's a better argument to make. Okay, that was a lot of talking. Any other questions? I think we have 10 more minutes, so. Yeah. Thanks.
So you mentioned that people with privilege are less likely to be penalized for, speaking up for diversity and inclusion. But are there special conditions which make it more likely for them to be rewarded? Because, in the situation, in the picture you described there, wouldn't a person with these privileges be threatening the privileges that their other?
Yes. Yeah, so the question is, so in many, we've seen the research that shows in these particular situations, allies are not going to be penalized or may even be helped by speaking up for members of marginalized groups. But I've just described a situation in which people are very aware that this is where they're getting their benefit, and they would probably be opposed to that. Well, yes, absolutely. When you are working with a group of people who don't value diversity and inclusion, you're probably not going to get benefit, right? From speaking up, even as an ally. So the situation they were looking at was evaluating a group of people who believed that fairness was important, and it was interesting to see that they were only able to deal with fairness if it came in this particular form of people working for members of groups they weren't part of, right? So yes, that's part of why I talk about using your power and influence wisely, like thinking about how to use your energy. If you are in a situation in which someone has way more power than you, and by speaking up in this way, all that's going to happen is you're going to get fired. I mean, if getting fired is to your advantage, go for it, right? But maybe that's not the best way to use your time and energy, is to do something that's going to get you an enormous amount of repercussions. So, in the back there.
Self-education. Aside from workshops, what have companies or people done to really self-educate about being inclusive?
Yeah, so what about self-education? What do companies do for this area? Yeah, so talks like this are fairly common, and having some sort of mix of tech talk and diversity and inclusion-oriented talk usually works pretty well. The unconscious bias training is, of course, an enormous factor in raising awareness of what's going on. I think it raises awareness. That's an initial first step. I think the Ally Skills Workshop is about taking action once you've had your awareness raised. I've talked to other companies that have a system where there's an article that everyone reads and then discusses at lunch. So that's a thing. Or perhaps there's other companies that have a Slack channel where the purpose of that is discussion of research that they've read recently. So those are some examples that I can think of right away. I think there was another question up there. Yeah.
Since targets are often at the bottom of organizational hierarchies and potential allies are sort of at the top, have you found that it's actually valuable to sort of impose training on leaders for diversity and inclusion and allies, because they're not the ones who are necessarily motivated to be self-starters about these things?
Yeah, so given that targets are at the bottom of the hierarchy, allies, people who potentially could be allies, people who have more privilege are usually at the top in terms of corporate hierarchy. Does it make sense to impose training, to have required training? Well, it's interesting. So we've got a law saying that all managers of companies larger than 55 employees, it's something like that, at least in California, need to take sexual harassment prevention training, right? And it's optional for everyone else. The downside, like I am overall pro this requirement as a legal thing. The downside, of course, is that there's a ton of super bad sexual harassment prevention training out there. Like there's ones where people just laugh and giggle their way through it, like that would ever happen. People, you, like, yes, that would happen. It's not a joke. It happened to me, right? You know, it's not done very well. The particular thing, I think it's very interesting because it's sort of goes back into this question I get a lot, which is, how do we convince people to become allies, right? And the answer is you can't. I can tell you the ways that I've seen it happen. One way, especially for people who are very data and science oriented, is that you just read enough studies. Like somebody sends you enough studies. I don't know why you're getting these studies, but you are. And eventually you're like, that's a lot of studies. I think that might be true, right? For me, it was realizing one day in 2001 that I could not think of a single other woman doing Linux kernel work at that time in the world. And there were hundreds of people working on the Linux kernel. I was like, I believe this is not chance, right? So experiencing it is one way. Often people will have somebody very close to them, like they're someone they're related to, someone they're married to, someone they're extremely close to at work, someone they were friends with for 20 years, will have something totally outrageous happen to them. And that'll be their awakening. And sometimes it's hearing, like working in a company for a couple of years, and then one day, for some reason, there's something that makes this okay, and your coworkers tell you about all the oppression and miserable experiences they've had at your company, you know, maybe with your fellow coworkers, maybe with people outside of the company, right? And it's people you're not super close to, but it's a lot of them and they're close enough to you, and it's just such a mind-blowing thing, right? So those are the things that I've seen work. The unconscious bias training fits into the, I read a whole lot of studies and now I feel like I believe them all, especially the unconscious bias training done by Paradigm IQ by Joel Emerson. It's extremely data-oriented and very, very appealing for software engineers. So yeah, you can't make people do this, and sometimes, sometimes people just have to leave their jobs in order for progress to be made. It's great if you can convince people to change their minds, but sometimes you can't. Humans are, it would be terrible if you could convince people to stop being allies by presenting them the right set of research, right? So, okay, that's enough there. I'm done. We're done. Yep, we're done. Thank you so much.